Loretta's videos of our meetings are fantastic, and we really appreciate it. I'm Sue Klein. The other co-president will be here as quickly as she can. We welcome you all, and particularly we welcome our speakers today. We're talking about a topic that we haven't addressed very much, perhaps because we haven't had the opportunity of having very many major professional organizations who aren't fully devoted to gender equity and women's issues have all women's leadership teams. And now I discovered happily that we have both the AFT and the NEA with all women's high-level elected leadership teams. And we also have some scientific organizations like the American Chemical Society that has an all-women's leadership team. And so we are fortunate enough to have some of the leaders and representatives talk to us today about the issues, particularly from the slant of how having an all-women's leadership team is helping them advance gender equality goals. So we usually have introductions first. Let me just say that I will pass around a couple of copies of Ms. Magazine. We give a copy to each of the presenters. But we welcome that. And we also have wonderful other materials. Catherine Hill was kind enough to bring her brand new publication, Barriers and Biases, and they're probably copies for everybody. And it's also online on leadership, and she will be serving as a summarizer, helping us understand some of the leadership and gender equity issues that we hear from our presenters. We're going to start off the meeting without doing introductions first because we have Donna Nelson on the phone, and Donna is the president of the American Chemical Society, and aside from that, Donna is a longtime leader in gender equity research and issues in the area of STEM as a chemistry professor. Donna, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Good. Great, it's working.
Okay.
So why don't you get us started, because it's really unique having a scientific organization with an all-women's leadership team.
Yes. First, I'd like to say that I really appreciate everything that the Feminist Network Foundation, Feminist Majority Foundation has been doing all these years. I do keep up with it, and I visited you once in person a few years ago, and I do appreciate all of your activities, and I think that what you're doing today, turning to focus on women once they are in leadership positions, what happens. And I think that is important. We don't have enough women in leadership positions. In my opinion, I do understand there are a few organizations where we happen to have all women in the presidential sequence right now, but I still think that it happens too seldomly. So I do think that this subject certainly does merit a discussion. And I will give you some ideas that, just from my own personal observation, obviously I don't speak for the entire American Chemical Society, but I can tell you my experiences and observations. First of all, when you're looking at women leaders, whether we are, whether the entire presidential sequence is female or not, I think that you have to test your assumptions in assuming that women are necessarily going to be extremely supportive of other women. That you'll find that this is going to the level of support will vary wildly, just like it does among men for women. And so, I think that it's pretty obvious that I have been supporting women for a long time because I did the Nelson Diversity Surveys, and I've been very public about all of that. And they are available now. They have their own Wikipedia page. And so you can read about those if you're not familiar with them. It's just Nelson Diversity Surveys on the Wikipedia site. And so, if you say that a woman is active in things like this, then you're going to know that she's supporting other women and will probably continue to support other women. But other than that, if you can't really see that, a woman has supported other women in the past, she may or may not, and you just don't know. You'll have to go in and find out. Sometimes it can just, there are different reasons for the differences in these things. Sometimes they're just too busy, or sometimes they feel like it's going to endanger them if they speak out on a topic which is controversial, although thankfully this is becoming less controversial now because so many younger women are speaking out. But I think that, now that you do have a larger number of women in leadership positions, I think that you don't have to be quite so grateful whenever a woman does achieve a leadership role and just necessarily, blindly go in and, support them. I think you can sort of take a look and see what their position is on women first. Because, there are some women that do undermine other women and undercut other women, and it just doesn't make sense to support someone or strengthen a person who is not going to return the favor. So those are my points. We have enough women in leadership positions now. I think you can just be a little more selective.
Great.
I'd be interested in hearing any feedback on that.
I just have a question. Could you mention how having a women's leadership team, or you as a woman president, are specifically planning to increase gender equality or diversity in the organization?
Well, like I said, when a woman, just like any other, just like men, when a woman reaches that level, she's frequently very independent and has her own mind made up about exactly what she's going to do. And, women will differ in the level in which they want to support other women. And, they may agree and they may not agree. You may or may not know that I just had a symposium on diversity at the last National ACS meeting. And I had everyone that I could think of who has done data collection in chemistry and in science generally come and speak at there. I invited them. Some of them weren't able to make it. I have supported Alison Campbell's efforts on you know, gay, lesbian, you know, I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't remember all of the abbreviations, but on on her effort. And I think I step up and support other people, you know, happily. I see a need for it, and I do that a lot. But you can't necessarily expect other women to, you know, think exactly the same way. And if the people don't all have the same mind, you know, they're not going to be working together. And so that's why I was saying, you know, you can't just assume that they're all going to be thinking the same way, because it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. It might be disappointing, but it just doesn't happen.
Okay, this is great. I hope that you will stay on the phone and listen in as we have the other presenters and comment as appropriate. For as long as you can, Donna. We really appreciate your taking the time out to give us your views as the president of the ACS. And
yes, my pleasure. I'm happy to be supported. But again, I would be interested to know if anyone has any feedback or similar experiences to what I just said.
I think you'll hear a lot of it. We'll go on with the other presenters. What I'd like to do next is have Connie Cordovilla introduce our wonderful leader, Mary Catherine Ricker, from the American Federation of Teachers.
Thanks, Sue. Mary Catherine Ricker is our Executive Vice President of the American Federation of Teachers. She had a lot of women's support in 2014 when she was elected overwhelmingly to that position. So I can tell you that we are pretty much of a single mind about Mary Catherine. She has been the president of the St. Paul, Minnesota Federation of Teachers since 2005, at least she was. Are you still, no?
No, I resigned when I won this position. Yeah.
But she's been an AFT vice president since 2012, and she's part of our teacher and program policy, or was part of our teacher program and policy culture, which sets our educational policy movement and strategies for our union. She has championed innovative teacher-built solutions that improve teaching and learning, as well as strengthening public education. She is someone who does community engagement as though it was a second skin. She is involved in many things. And I'm not just talking through my head. I mean, she is a leader who shows to us at the AFT how it is that it needs to be done. She, of course, has taught in many places, from St. Cloud and St. Paul, Minnesota, in Camas, Washington, and actually in Seoul, South Korea. Someday we'll have to talk about that. That sounds interesting. And she's represented the AFT and St. Paul Fed in Finland, Germany, Mexico, and the Middle East. She serves on Education Minnesota's governing board. I don't know if you know, but NEA and AFT are joint in Minnesota. It's one of the states that has
the whole state.
The whole state.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes, just like we are in 4 other states, New York
And in Flint, Michigan too, as I point out.
Yeah, well, there you go.
We're not merged in Flint.
No, we're not merged in Flint.
We're not merged in Flint.
We used to be.
Not anymore. She has also served as a member of the boards of Take Action Minnesota, the St. Paul Regional Labor Federation, the St. Paul Public Schools Foundation, and the Twin Cities Generation Next. She was selected to be co-chair of Minnesota's Department of Education Teacher Evaluation Group in 2012, and she's been a member of their Education Finance Group since 2011. The lady's got moxie, she's a leader, and we support her.
I appreciate that. That was like the full-on peacock introduction.
It's true.
Well, I'll just give some like brief reflections, and then I am actually interested too in the different questions you have for you know, what we find challenging, what we find natural. I would have to say that you know, really my leadership started with a similar story to lots of other women, in that it started with strong women in my family. And that even if you grow up in a very Western society that tends to take on very patriarchal characteristics, when there is a strong woman in your family, it ends up sort of seeping into you as a young woman. And while the women may have feigned the traditional roles for the men in our family, it was clear at the end of the day who made the decisions, whether it was my grandfather or my grandmother on either side of the family. And I look at that and I think it was that confidence and that second nature of having a place at the table, whether that was physically at Thanksgiving, literally at family gatherings, or whether it became figuratively in sort of the order of the day and the politics that got discussed, around that table, or the local issues that got brought up, that made me realize that my expectation of a place at the leadership table was really born when I was little. Right, when I was 3, 4, 5 years old, and I was asked for my opinion about things. Right, now granted, lots of our opinions for a toddler might be developmentally appropriate. Right, do you want to wear the red pants or the blue pants? Did you notice you're wearing pants today? Right, and it was that developmentally appropriate decision making that got instilled in me, to the point that as a young woman, as a 12, 13, 14-year-old, as the opinions I was asked for became a little more serious, on the issues of the day, or on maybe on the presidential election, or on the news of the day, it was clear that I was expected to have an opinion. That it wasn't just the opinion of the family figure, whoever that may loom large in your family or mine, and so I found myself not only having opinions, but deciding that they mattered, and deciding that the opinions of other people mattered as well. And so I sort of took that attitude, and it doesn't take a lot to nurture that attitude and shape it into, if your opinion matters, then you belong leading somewhere with that opinion. And those what might look now as small experiences, right? That student council victory in 9th grade, or the student government victory in my junior year of college, or whatever. Those things, it is critically important that when a young woman wants to explore leadership, that nothing gets in her way. Because I'm one of those women who can say that I didn't have a lot get in my way. I can think of a few of those stinging barriers, but they ended up sort of stinging me rather than halting me. I had far more people invest in me. And I'm thinking back to a junior high social studies class where, by then, while I may not have necessarily intellectually understood the word feminist, or understood that I was one or becoming one, my social studies teacher, who was an awesome man, was handing out an assignment. We were learning about the building of this modern U.S. country, and he handed out a play we were going to read to get an idea of the debate that occurred to actually write some of our nation's founding documents. And so he was going to assign parts, or ask people to volunteer for parts, and I did a quick scan, and there were no women's parts. And so my hand shoots up, and I said, "Mr. Brisboy, there are no parts for women." And he said to me, "Well, there are plenty of parts for leaders. Which part would you like?" And he assigned me a part as a leader, and that really stuck with me. The way he acknowledged the absence of women, but he acknowledged something in me too, and assigned me a part in that little play, and I won't forget that. He didn't go off on some tangent about, well, you have to understand, women weren't really leaders back then, or he did not try to apologize for it, did not try to even necessarily put it in its history. I mean, the history is pretty apparent. Right? I mean, he didn't have to sort of talk down to me and explain the history. He just pivoted it, and he found a role for me. And I think of that lesson often, especially when I'm often asked, so you talk about women in leadership, and yet you went into one of the most feminized, traditionally female professions you could. And not only that, but I got my license. So not only did I become a teacher, but I became an English teacher, right? So, I mean, the only probably more feminized license in, you know, in education is probably elementary school teacher. And yet, I was able to take that and find ways to make that role about leadership. And again, not about being, again, taking on that stereotypical role, but perhaps using it to my advantage to get, to find a space with other women to build power. And that was through my union. My union, the St. Paul Federation of Teachers, was actually founded in 1918. So 2 years before women earned the right to vote, women in St. Paul, because it was the St. Paul Federation of Women Teachers, actually, who organized first, go figure. 2 years before women earned our right to vote, we in St. Paul, I wasn't there personally, but I've read a lot about it, we in St. Paul decided we would practice democracy in our workplace. If our government wasn't going to let us practice democracy in our community, we were going to practice it in our workplace, and we organized a union. Shortly thereafter, the men organized as well in St. Paul, and that was in 2005. That was the union I inherited when I was elected president of the St. Paul Federation of Teachers. And I say inherited because there is a lot of history first in trade unionism and women's roles in trade unionism, and then the role of trade unionism in stabilizing women's lives, right? Providing women, employment, living wages, pensions, so we had secure retirements, benefits, regardless of marital status, regardless of family status. And so I talk about that inheritance, even though it was an election I won, because so much came with that. And so when I became president, sort of intentionally and sort of by act of serendipity. Quite frankly, what was happening was there were leading up to 2005, and when I decided to run for president of St. Paul, I was experiencing sort of this dominant narrative about teachers and our unions, right? And that we exist, teachers really only exist to collect a paycheck and get their summers off. There's actually, there's not a lot of skill involved in teaching. There's not a lot of pride in teachers, and certainly unions protect the worst of that. And that was just not my lived experience. Not as a third generation teacher, seeing my grandfather and my father and a number of family members become teachers and sort of watch their careers flourish, and certainly not my experience as a teacher for 13 years in a middle school classroom. And I realized I can do two things about it, right? I can close my classroom door, ignore all of that white noise outside, and just try to do the best job I could for the students in front of me. Or I could wade into it and to decide that I would forge a different narrative around teachers and their unions, one that was my lived experience, that people go into teaching because we care desperately about improving people's lives. When really we could do just about anything, but we choose to teach. And that unions are actually incubators of innovation, and that when you successfully negotiate a promising educational practice and get it in your contract, that's actually an agreement teachers have with their students, even though legally it is an agreement teachers have with their school district. And taking that, and I got elected and realized that I wasn't going to make one bit of progress in reshaping this narrative if I didn't tap into what was fundamentally the strengths of those women that had been around me. Right, and that was you build power in community, that no one person alone can have the power that a collective group of people can have. And these were lessons that I saw from women all over the place. As at this point I was a newer mom, and, constantly being invited to PTA meetings and to help fundraise for my child's school and to help organize at my church. And you saw women running all of these things, right? You want to see someone who could probably run a Fortune 500 company, you hire the woman who runs your church bazaar, quite frankly, right? Like that, talk about someone who can juggle, walk and chew gum all at the same time. And so I realized in watching all of these great examples around me that women were most powerful when we were collectively acting. And so there had been also this narrative within the union movement had sort of shifted away from that collective power building to what had become sort of a,
I would cut. I could splice it together when it's over.
Exactly.
All right, and
What had become what I would say was a traditional male look at unionism, and that is that you elect one central figure, the power resides all with that one figure, the president, right? And it's that president who walks in and tells your boss that, this is the way it has to be, or this is the contract that got broken, et cetera. And so then it becomes this very cloistered relationship, and all the power rests in one place. And there were definitely people who expected that style of leadership. But I realized it was far more powerful when 12 of us showed up, right? Or when 50 of us showed up, or sometimes it had to be 500 of us showing up. And those are the sorts of things, building on that community power base, and that ended up where I ended up in conversations with Randy Weingarten, who in 2008 was elected president of AFT, and then hearing her stories of building power with parents in New York to approach the collective bargaining table together to win better working and learning conditions in their schools. She mentored me quite a bit. And so, in some respects, I look back on it, and I realize when she asked me to run with her in 2014, that this was going to be a fantastic partnership. And that in 2008 was the first time in many, many years where the American Federation of Teachers became an all-female leadership team. And I was elected then in 2014. So from 2008 until the present, we have been an all-female leadership team. And we had in our different points in our history, but this in our modern history, this was the first time in a long, long time. And I would one of the most pronounced differences I think I see when you have Randy Weingarten as our president and Loretta Johnson as our secretary treasurer, and now me as our executive vice president, but Fran Lawrence before that and Tony Cortese before that. I think one of the things you see is, one, tapping into the natural strengths of women. Again, so it's that collective power building, as well as that respect for decision making, that intensity, and I'll put it in my own family terms, and that is like on Thanksgiving you have your fights in the kitchen, but when you come out to the dining room table you break bread as a family, right? And you have when you are at the dining room table, you are eating as a family and you're visiting, and so if you're going to squabble, that happens in the kitchen, and that's fine. And I see that and what I see in that is a commitment to problem solving, quite frankly. And that is that it is no question we are going to sit down and break bread as a family. The question is, how are we going to resolve this conflict that we have, right? So that becomes my metaphor for, in some respects, the attitude women have to leadership. And that is, we don't blindly follow each other. We hold each other to really high standards. And I think this presidential election cycle is one example where sometimes, I don't know that we need to be so public with the standards we're holding each other to, but here we go. We hold each other to really high standards, but at the end of the day, once you've met that standard, there are women who will walk through fire for you, right? And so that's one thing that has become crystal clear to me. And then the second thing I would say too is our approach to problem solving, again, becomes centered in root causes. When I think of the things that we are championing at AFT, right? In our, so we're actually the second largest nurse and healthcare union in the country as well. And our approach to supporting nurses and healthcare providers is to get at the root causes of what the barriers are in them providing the best patient care possible, right? And that, at the end of the day, I think that is our collective characteristic of a female leadership team. When we want to see what we can do as a union to bring comfort or solutions to unaccompanied refugee children at our southern border, we think as women, quite frankly, and think not just what are we going to do right at the border, right, in providing perhaps comfort and clothing and everything else, but we actually dig deeper and we say, what conditions must exist for a woman to be so concerned about where her child is that she would put her child on a train through 3 different countries to a better life? What conditions must, and then so what do I do to support that woman and that condition so that she is not forced to make that decision? Getting all the way into those root causes oftentimes makes other elected officials really uncomfortable. But it's the conversation that needs to be had. It's not about just giving 12 and 14-year-old kids ankle bracelets so that they can't cross a border again. Because that's actually not going to help that mom sleep at night, right? Or help that sister or that grandmother sleep at night. It's actually getting to what conditions must be so deplorable that a mom actually sees a better future for her child, putting them on a train going through 4 different countries, than staying home. And I use that as one other example of the sort of issues that then get elevated, I think, when you have 3 women on a leadership team. And when Planned Parenthood was attacked last summer, one of the first things we did was look around and say that this feels like an attack on us. Aside from the fact that we are, a nurse and healthcare provider union, as well as a teachers union and a higher ed faculty union and a public employee union, and a paraprofessional union, we do see that in a union where we represent traditionally feminized professions, like healthcare or like education, that an attack on an institution that a lot of our members actually may rely on, or a lot of the people we serve, right, those people in healthcare or those students and families that we serve, we recognize this is about more than us. And I think that is one of the benefits, of the many benefits you get when you see a female leadership team at the head of an historic trade union. I'll stop there and wait for more discussion.
Well, that's great. I think it would probably make most sense with our time constraints to let Pamela Rios talk about her women's leadership team at NEA and reflect on how it may be similar or different from the AFT women's leadership team and other insights you might have. Pamela also has a lot of responsibility over many years for teaching leadership skills to NEA members, and I assume that those leadership skills that you teach are not only to women but to men as well. Mm-hmm. So this is right up Pamela's alley, and we're really fortunate to have her join us and reflect on that. Another thing, as we were pulling together the program, noticed in the introduction, it seems like NEA has about 80% female members, and AFT about 75%. Is that correct?
That sounds
So,
about right, yeah.
a slight difference there. Anything you want to comment on will be most welcome.
Well, on behalf of our 3 officers, Lily Eskelson Garcia, Rebecca Pringle, and Princess Moss, who's our Secretary-Treasurer, I'm here to represent them, and I only have 1 copy, but for those of you who don't know what they look like, I have a copy of the NEA Today from 2014, the year that they were elected as the 3 officers of the NEA. One of the differences is that our team, and as Catherine will comment, what is unique about our team is that they're all women of color. So Lily being Latina, and Princess and Rebecca being Black women of a union that is predominantly female, but predominantly white female. So the challenges, the awesomeness of what this team represents is about pushing our members and challenging our members to think a little differently, not only about leadership, but about where we stand as educators in this country. And I say that because we represent largely suburban and rural districts. So the women tend to be a little more conservative, a little more in alignment with their husbands and with their community about how to vote. Not really on the cutting edge of a lot of issues around LGBTQ or around immigration or around race and racism in education. And so our 3 officers represent a lot of different communities and a lot of different concerns across the board. And in alignment with what Mary Catherine has said about building a community, about building collective action around these issues, our 3 officers have been able to accomplish that quite a bit. One of our biggest points of excitement is around the creation of an NBIB. So at our representative assembly every year, we have these new business items. They're only a year. The collective body has to vote on them to approve it. We did an NBIB last year around institutional racism, and that's the recognition of our association that there are institutions in place, including education, that create barriers that prevent primarily children of color and children in poverty from reaching their full potential and their full levels of opportunity. And it overwhelmingly passed unanimously at our representative assembly, which is something we never have. And that is, to me, a key connection to the women that they then voted in as the officers. So educators recognize across this country, which we also represent what AFT calls paraprofessionals, we call education support professionals, which are our bus drivers, our cafeteria workers, our paraprofessionals, but also those school aides. They overwhelmingly felt that there was a need in education to make a statement and to acknowledge that there are barriers that we need help closing, and that education is not alone in that battle. So we need to pull in those conversations about housing, those conversations about healthcare, those conversations about the school to prison pipeline. And I don't think we would have had another governance team willing to go to bat so hardly if we did not have these 3 women in place. And so it's about also working with and relating to the AFT female team. So I think that relationship and the communication and the community building between the 2 associations, I think also occurs because the 2 leadership teams can talk to each other about a lot of things, and so we can collectively work on a lot more issues than we have in the past. So the whole conversation about immigration and refugee children and about children being picked up at bus stops by ICE, being identified and pulled off of buses or pulled out of school without their parents' knowledge. So even in larger context about a parent willing to put their child on a train or a plane and send them across 4 countries is when they get here, the students and the families don't know if they're going to make it home at the end of the day, if they're going to be sent to a detention center, and no one will know where they are. So those battles and those conversations we wouldn't be able to have, and we wouldn't be able to change without the women that we have in place. And to kind of piggyback on some of the things that Donna said, just because there are women in place doesn't necessarily mean that everyone always agrees. But there is a concerted effort to make sure exactly what Mary Catherine said about you may have disagreements behind the scenes, but there is a front, a united front that must be maintained, because there are a lot of people who are rooting for them to fail because they are women. And so I don't want us to walk away thinking that it's great, because I think there are a lot of challenges for women in power, even from within. And so to be as inclusive as you can with other people in the association is really important. To not only rely on the fact that they are women and women of color, but that they have issues that are of concern for everyone. So even though you may not have children of color in your classroom, the fact that the demographics of students in those classrooms are changing every day is something that we can't continue to ignore. The fact that we are feminized and 80% female in our association doesn't discount the fact that a large majority of them are white female. And so a lot of these conversations they feel left out of. And so how do we build the collective action, but also the collective concern of not just those individuals of color who are concerned about those students, but everyone in education concerned about saving public education. And changing the context of the story to prevent the reformers from telling our story. But that we as educators need to tell our stories and tell the stories overwhelmingly of what's happening in schools across the country. I'm going to end there.
Great. Now, we're very fortunate to have Catherine Hill, who's a leading feminist researcher from the American Association of University Women, and as you heard earlier, has been the primary author of this wonderful report on barriers and bias, the status of women in leadership. And hopefully she will talk today about how what she heard. Catherine, somebody can help you hand these out. So.
Yeah, no, it's fine, I'm ready to go.
Candy.
Sorry, I'm listening, and you want me to also bring together some of the issues that have been raised, and also talk very briefly. This is a very short and succinct, I don't have quite enough copies, so if you guys could share so that people can see. But I can also tell you what it's in, and you can look at it yourself. It's also, some of them are in the book. So what we did is look at the social science literature, and on the topic of women and leadership, what we did in this project, as we do in many of the projects we do at AEW, is look at the peer-reviewed research. We looked at about 400 or 500 peer-reviewed articles, and we also looked at reports from the government. We looked at nonprofit sources. We looked at a lot of different things. What we found is that there is an exhaustive amount of literature in leadership, and it was exhausting to go through it. And we in the end don't have a full, what I would call a full literature review, simply because the more you read about this topic, there's more there is. Now, how many of you have read a book about leadership? Okay. How many of you have read a book about women and leadership? An article about women and leadership? Yes. Okay. So you've all heard about this. I'm going to start with the style question, and then I'm going to get right into my presentation, because that was brought up by Donna Nelson in the beginning, and it's been echoed throughout, which is, are women different kinds of leaders than men are? And I want to start by everything that we did in this report. It is very important to look at people by their race and ethnicity, because the black woman's experience is very different from the white woman's experience, which is also different from the Hispanic woman's experience. So we're really trying to understand these disparate experiences at the same time. But the overwhelming, there's a set of scholars who say women end up behaving just like men behave, because these positions are kind of conscripted. You do what's in your position. Okay. And there's another group of scholars that says, well, women are different. They try to build circles of colleagues and power around them. They try to reach down and have a network, and that's how they build their power. And I'm just going to say, I think both are true in different circumstances. What we decided to do, there's a lot of definitions of leadership. In fact, one article identified 850 different definitions of leadership. So we decided for this purpose and this particular place, we're not going to talk about those wonderful leaders who do the church bazaar or who do these other great things, which we, very happy they do. But we're going to look at paid leadership, and we're going to look at people in the highest positions of power, because we want those positions too. Women are already doing great on the ground, providing services for one another and for our families, but they're not well represented at the top. So let's look at the gender leadership gap, and first thing is, let's look at a couple of these charts. Let's look at Congress. So women make up 19%, under 20%, and we have two parts of the pie. The women are the orange, and the dark orange is the white women, and the lighter orange is the women of color. When we look at U.S. governors, we also see a pretty similar story. So the men are that sort of purpley gray color. No one will let me use blue and pink anymore. It just doesn't work. So women are again that orange and light orange. Then we see this is an interesting chart which we got from the data from the EEOC. Are you familiar with that? This is on their website if you look. So this is the private sector. We're looking at who are executives, a top level position. So it's the CFO, COO, maybe top 5 or 6 people, like these women here. Well, unfortunately, you're an exception. Yeah. And you're an exception. And a majority are white men, and white women are slightly underrepresented, but they're still pretty sizable at 24%. Black women are at 2%. So this is an area, and you can obviously read the others. They're at 1%. So this is a gap that is really influenced deeply by race and ethnicity. And if we had added in the government numbers, they would have looked different. But it's just valuable to look just at private sector because we see this really large gap. So you're all asking why, right? Why is there a gender leadership gap? Well, in the reading that we did and the analysis that we did find that parenting and caregiving remains a concern and a problem for women in their careers. So that's still true. But that hasn't changed a whole lot. And what we found to be even more important was looking at implicit bias as well as overt bias. Now, overt bias is just like someone saying, well, a woman can't do this job, she's just not capable of it. You don't hear that very often, right?
Oh.
Once in a while you do.
You're sitting in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Inside the belt.
Okay, but there's a certain PC, yes, you're right, absolutely. People go ahead and say all kinds of things. So nevertheless, another form of bias that affects really everyone is implicit bias or unconscious bias. How many of you have already heard of this concept? Yeah. Okay, the whole gang, good. I'm glad this is becoming a really interesting phenomenon that we're all paying attention to this because it reminds us we all have biases. We all need to recognize and understand our biases, and we all need to grapple with them. And at the very least, if you can't always change them, even if you want to change them, but because your conscious thoughts are one place and your implicit bias is in another place, but you can account for them. So if you know you have a bias, and you can pay special attention in those important circumstances like hiring and firing, like assigning work, like assigning training opportunities. There are lots of ways in which we shape each other's careers, and implicit bias can affect those in all those different situations. On the AUW website, we have a implicit bias tool about women and leadership. It's limited, but I think it's a valuable tool because what we found, we've had so far 30,000 people take this tool and complete it, and a big proportion of our test takers are identified as feminist. And so we thought we wouldn't get any bias at all, right? Because they're, explicitly feminists. They say this is who they are. And yet we found a small bias against women in leadership. Not a large bias on average, but a bias. So it goes to show you no matter what's in your conscious mind, in the back of your mind, all kinds of things can be happening. Mm-hmm. So we think this has a lot to do with leadership, because the feeling of leadership is so much about how you sense a person, as opposed to an objective. So if someone's a good repair person, or if someone is good at computer programming, you can just look at the outcome, and it's not as, it's clear, it's not as subjective, thank you. So what do we do about, now the more important question is what can we do to close the gap? And actually, before we go to that, I want to say, why should we care? So do we even care that women are not in these leadership positions as much as we'd like? We want more women like these women sitting next to me. One, we care about this because it's not just about women getting opportunities to be leaders. It's also about men have opportunities to spend time with their families, to spend time with their children, to have different kinds of roles, or to do other things, to not feel that constant pressure to be the breadwinner. And it's good for families in terms of, good for businesses, and this is one of the areas I think is so important. A lot of people say that it makes businesses more profitable. Catalyst has a number of reports on that thing. I will say, I want to go back a step with that. I think it's very hard to prove what makes a company profitable. But what we have proven in the social science literature is that leadership, when you have diverse groups, and you have on the other side your lone genius, okay? Mm-hmm. Special person, super high IQ, right? You give them this complicated task, the diverse group of people who dedicated to working on it are likely to outperform your genius. So what companies need to do is not necessarily just look for their geniuses who are, they need many perspectives. Maybe they need that genius too, but they need many perspectives. And that is going to make them more creative and more innovative. Now, whether or not that leads to profitability, I think it probably does. But I think what we can really clearly argue from this literature that's out there is that that diversity, and this is racial diversity obviously as well as gender diversity, but it creates stronger outcomes in terms of creativity, thinking outside the box, and innovation. So it's a good thing. By the way, I think that it's good for our whole country for a variety of reasons, but I think you guys are all probably part of the choir on this. But we know when we have more diversity, we see questions that should be in the mix end up in the mix. Mm-hmm. That's how I guess I put it. So I'm really focused, and I think AUW is really interested in all kinds of leadership, but we want to pay attention to these decision makers because they are so critical to all of our lives. And I can give you more examples of women who are powerful and successful in careers, and yet we don't see them being in their leadership roles. For example, 75 or 76% of public school teachers are women, and only 20% of superintendents are women. Okay, so we're in all women. There's obviously lots of candidates of brilliant women in this field, and everyone agrees that women can teach, but somehow when it comes to leadership, there's something that bothers people. So what can we do to close the gap? I'm spending a lot of time talking to people about the implicit association test, not because it's brand new, but because it's important for us to understand in terms of gender. And different kinds of different women in different situations. I think that what's important is that we think that these stereotypes are a thing of the past because we aren't hearing them, right? People aren't saying, well, that group can't do this and this group can't do that, but it's still there. And the employers, they can do a lot of things like good diversity training. You can do diversity training can be good and it can be bad. It can actually be harmful if you don't do it right. So you need to pay attention to the detail and make sure it's evidence-based. I don't know how many of you have heard of the blind screening? Okay. A couple people have not, but what people are doing in a lot of companies now is taking off the name and taking off other kinds of identifiers and just giving the resume back to the people making the decision. And it's been proven to have a big effect. Have all of you heard of the study of Jennifer and John? None? Okay, I'm going to tell it for the few who haven't. I'll be very quick. Study on resumes. The researchers created a resume for a lab manager position, a strong resume, but not a super strong, because this is when we see implicit bias creating the biggest issues for us is when things are in the middle. You know, we get the extreme. This person walks on water. Let's hire them. And then we have, this person doesn't even know our address. Let's, take care of that. So, but, this middle level, pretty good. Okay. One resume goes out under the name Jennifer, and one goes under the name John. And they get back they send it out to science, technology, engineering, and math professors. And they send in their responses. And can you guess who was chosen to be hired?
John was chosen
John,
twice as often as Jennifer.
Yep, and in terms of the salary offered, John did better, and in terms of mentoring, John, they were more willing to mentor John. Now, what was interesting is it was not that they didn't like Jennifer, and besides they have exactly the same credentials, but they felt she wasn't competent. And that's what women actually of all races struggle with. Are you competent? Do you need to prove it over and over again?
Yep.
And so I think that it's not, women are likable. You don't need to worry about that as much. I mean, you need to be likable and you need to be competent. But I would, if you have to, at times you want to, don't be too likable. You want to be taken seriously. So any event, those are things that we all can do. In terms of policymakers, I think that the Family Medical Leave Act, things about the Paycheck Fairness Act, which I know we've all sort of given up on, but we shouldn't. It's still going to be there. We're going to get it passed. Hopefully we'll have a better Congress in the near future. And that's all I want to say.
Well, that's wonderful. Now, we'd like to...
Responsive Congress.
Yeah.
More women. One that
Open this
actually
up.
does things. Or their job. And works
Donna,
best.
are you still on? I'm not sure if Donna is still on. We're trying to see if we can get Donna back on, but we have a lot of people that have a lot to share. I think that what might be fun to do, instead of having direct responses, is to quickly go around, have everybody quickly introduce themselves. If you have something really urgent to say about leadership or a question to ask one of the presenters, please do so.